Alright, hello and welcome back to the first video in the tool showcase / tutorial series, and this time we'll be going over a terrain tool. So the base idea of this terrain tool is input any sculpt from a landscape or a bunch of objects with them, so you can see them here in Unreal, and stuff them into the tool, and the tool will process them and add noise passes over it. So let's actually first look at the setup process. So yeah, here I have the tool in the scene, and the only thing you need to set it up is basically drag the tool in the scene, which I've already done, and then you will be greeted by this interface, and Unreal's interface is being a bit annoying. There we go. So it won't look like this, it'll probably look a bit more like this. So as you can see, we have our landscape input, and the only thing you need to do here is click on the landscape, scroll down a little bit if Unreal lets you, and click recommit landscape. So there you can see it's going to process a bit and then do its job. And then here we need to switch from geometry input to world outliner input. And what this is going to allow us to do is basically what I'm about to do right here. And underneath you can already see a bit of a spoiler, but let's not go there yet. Let's put some objects in here. So we can click start selection. So this is going to lock this view, so I can't do anything here. Well, I can't click that, but it says here use current selection, unlock details panel. So basically I can now select a bunch of objects and use the current selection. So it's going to do a bunch more processing, and as you can see in this list here, we now have our objects that we just selected. And let's actually turn off the input geometry and landscape so we can see what's happening with the tool. So when we turn them off, you can see that right here we have our tool. So this is the current result, and as you can see, it doesn't look great right now. These are some very harsh edges and transitions between the objects and the rest, but as you can already see, the objects intersection, so the seams are pretty smoothed out, and I'll get to that later. And again, here are a bunch of smooth things. So yeah, this is basically what you get when you first open the tool. So let's actually start looking at the interface the tool provides you with. So immediately we have 4 main tabs that we can kind of divide the terrain up in. So we have objects, which of course are these bad boys. We have sculpted parts, and that will only affect parts that you sculpt. So here I kind of sculpted a kind of mountain range looking deal, and then we have flat areas, and those are kind of intended to fill in empty space. So I think, if I recall, there's some empty space here that's going to be filled in, and some empty space going on here, and that's going to basically be filled in by this flat area option, and then some overall options that we'll get into last. So let's start off with the options for the objects. And let's start off with the seams. So basically these options are going to control how the objects interact with each other. So here I have a cone and a rock, and this blend is already pretty smooth due to the nature of these objects. But with this, you can see that if I disable this, so here I'm setting the seam base radius to 0. And what this basically means is there's a collision object between these. So a Boolean operator takes this seam here and turns it into a piece of geometry. So this thing here, this seam here, is turned into a piece of geometry, and that piece of geometry is then projected onto the landscape and gives it a mask. And if we set this seam base radius to 0, it basically means that that object has a radius of 0. So if we set this to 1, we're going to see a very slight version of this appearing, and it's already very apparent, and that's because we have a expand seam mask. And that is basically taking, these are kind of the same thing, but you can see this as an addition onto this. So this will basically take the seam base radius and add 5 onto it. So if I expand this and then decrease this to maybe 3, you'll see that it didn't decrease a lot. So actually let's put this to 0 so we can kind of get the most outer values of this. And as you can see, it barely blends now. So I usually like to keep this at 5 because that seems to give a good mid-range. And if we put this to 5 as well, we basically have a total radius of 10 units. Now, in Houdini that is meters, and in Unreal I'm presuming it's meters as well, but I'm not very familiar yet with the conversion between the two, so I'll be looking into that a bit more. And this blur is basically well, exactly what it says. It's an amount of blur that happens with the mask to make the transition a bit smoother. So if I turn this to 0, the transition is going to be a slight bit harder. So this is not something that is very apparent. We can mainly see it in this here. You can see this edge is just a bit softer now. And then we have apply blur to object seams, and that, well, that does just what it says. It takes this seam here and it applies a blur to this amount. So if we put this on 20, it is going to apply 20 iterations of blur. And this here, it's very apparent. Maybe we can fly over to this object here. So if we up it to, let's say, 50 to really make it very drastic, these objects are just going to flow into each other and average it out. I would say don't make this value too high, because it'll kind of eat away at the object like this. Usually going at around 20 is a good level to go at. So 10 to 20. You know what, let's go in the middle, let's do 15. And there we go. So now we have our objects seam set up. We can move on to the object noise, and this is disabled by default, so as are all the other noise paths. So here you can see sculpt noise, flat area noise, and overall. This is disabled by default, so not everything just kind of turns on and slows your computer down by an insane amount. So let's start off by enabling this, and it's going to take a bit to process, but as you can see here, it just adds an enormous noise pass here, and this is a very aggressive noise pass. And what you're seeing here immediately is just the distortion kind of tearing this apart and moving it around. And here it's not, you know, as you can see, it kind of poses some issues, but let's fix that now. So the object mask is the first thing you're going to be greeted with. And again, what this mask means is it takes the object, it projects it onto the landscape, and now you basically have a two-dimensional mask of your object. And if it's kind of clipping with a kind of a transition like this, it will clip with it, basically. And let's say this mask, I would usually say, if you see that this is kind of happening, I would say try to lower your expansion of your mask, because what's that is going to do is it's going to make the effective radius of your mask less. And that's what these options are for. They are there to make sure that the mask doesn't affect as large of an area, because these two options here, or these two tabs, are affected by the mask made in this area. And so are some of the options in later places. Now the blur objects option, that basically dictates how much an initial blur is going to go over your objects. And if I lower this, let's actually put it at 0 just to kind of contrast it a lot, you'll see that a lot of these edges are very harsh, and that the transition between object and terrain isn't very smooth. So if we up this to 10 again, you'll be able to see that this transition is ever so slightly smooth. I guess the objects I picked aren't amazing for this, and the noise passes I'm throwing over it are very intense. Ah, there we go, that's the problem. So this is distortion, and what it will do is it will displace your object along the in Unreal, the Y and X axes. In Houdini, or some other 3D creation software, it'll be Z and X, but in this case it's Y and X. So if we lower this to, say, 50, you're going to see that a lot of this rugged detail here, yeah, there we go, it just disappeared, and it's much more conforming to its original shape. And now let's have a look again at the blur objects. So if we lower this to 0, it's going to take a bit. This just became a bit harsher. Now this is a very subtle effect. This isn't as impactful as other things, but if you're looking for a kind of more subtle transition and trying to like make it, just add some, here we go, you can just see it now. This basically makes the transition easier and better. So yeah, these are some options for the larger distortion. So amplitude is how far it can reach, and the element size is, well, the scale of the noise. So if we put this to 100, we're going to see that this is basically going to become a lot smaller. So you saw that the shapes kind of shrunk, and if we make this very large, then again it's going to just become way larger as the element size increases. So I would say usually keep this around 200 unless you're trying to go for a very specific look. When we're done with the large shapes, we get to the detail page, and this offers a few options. Yeah, mainly again 2 parts. It's gonna affect the height distortion or the height offset. So let's say we put this at 100, and in a second, there we go. You can see here that it kind of displaces it a bit. So if you put this at 200 maybe to really contrast, and there we go. So as you can see here, it is going to displace the terrain or the objects by a bit to kind of break up the shape. And again, this distortion here is going to displace it on the X and Y axes. Again, this is mostly just to break up your shapes. The large shapes are there to majorly break up your geometry, and these smaller ones are kind of to fine-tune your look. This smaller distortion, you want to keep this at a low amplitude, because as you can see here, let's actually put it at a bit of a higher amplitude and show what that does. It's basically going to, yeah, it's going to become very spiky. So to avoid that, keep it under. So basically what I found that you want to keep the amplitude of a distortion under half of the element size. So now we're still getting that spikiness, but it's not as violent. So if you keep the distortion amplitude under half the element size, so in this case about 35 will be half, and if we're under that, that's fine. So let's disable this for now and move on to the sculpted area. So as you can see, when I turn that off, all the sculpting disappears, or all the object noise disappears. And when we move on to the noise, we have a couple of options here. So the sculpted area mask, I'll first turn on the noise so you can see what that does. So let's wait a second here, and here we go. So yeah, as you can see, this is probably the most, yeah, this affects the terrain the most. It basically just distorts the whole thing. And as you can see here, it also affects the objects here a bit, and that's all depending on how you set up your object mask. So if I set up this object mask to have an expansion of 20, it's going to process a bit. And again, I'm not seeing these effects as much as I'd like to, so let's just set it to 50 real quick. Well, I'm not really seeing the effects I want to, but it's something I'll have to fix in the next iteration, I suppose. But yeah, this will affect how much the how much the objects are affected by this. But in general, the sculpting pass will affect everything. So even the flat areas here, they're very slightly affected. Not as much in the center, but at the edges definitely. So yeah, this minimum trigger height, that's probably one that is kind of confusing maybe. And what that basically means is it's the minimum height that the mask of the sculpt is detected. So this sculpt is detected based on height. So the higher it is, the more affected it's going to be by the sculpting option. So if we up this value to say 20, it is going to go up. And as you can see here, a larger part is now left without noise. So what we did is we raised the lower border. And if we put this to 0, it's going to affect everything. So I don't want to do that. For now, I'll just keep it at 10. And the mask blur basically will kind of smoothen the transition between the sculpted areas and the non-sculpted terrains. So if we set this to 0, it's going to cook. And there we go. So it is now going to be a much harder transition than usual. So let's put this at 20, I would say. Let's actually disable that gizmo by pressing G twice. And there we go. So now let's get to the sculpting noise. And this is kind of divided up into 3 parts. Starting off with an input option that kind of blurs the mask again. So this is basically a secondary blur to affect it even a bit again. So if you put this at 0, it is going to make those transitions a bit harder. And as you can see here, this is now less affected. So if you put this at input, they're both at 0 now. Oops, let's not spoil that yet. So let's put this mask blur at 0. Yeah, so as you can see here, it's becoming very spiky, and that's because the transition is just going from 0 to 1. So generally, this mask blur is kind of what I would say a base mask blur, and then within the sculpt option, this is just to kind of fine-tune that, to blur the blur, so to say. Now, these sculpted areas probably have the most noise pass options of everything, so let's have a look at this. Again, we're starting off with some distortion in the large shapes section, and this is to kind of break up the pattern. So if we go to the detail section and put this at 0, the amplitude, which effectively disables the noise. So we can already start seeing some kind of cellular detail from the cell noise. And if we up the amplitude to, let's say, 200, we're going to see that, yeah, it's hard to see right now. At least I sometimes have difficulty seeing it, but what we're doing is we're adding a curl noise that basically displaces the terrain and kind of breaks up your sculpts. So we're getting these very nice round kind of swirly shapes in here. So I would say don't make these too high again. Here I'm kind of breaking my own keep it under half rule, but that's because the roughness on this distortion is very low, and what that means is you're not going to get that very high detail. It's just going to take the entire mass of the sculpt and displace it. So again, here we can already see that a bit of that cell noise, and that's basically controlled by this option. So if we put this to 50, it's going to pop out a bit more. So yeah, there you go, kind of ups the contrast, and this is just there to add some more large detail. We can control the element size, but let's say we want it to be smaller. If we put that to 50, we're going to see more cells. So yeah, there you go. If you want to give your terrain a bit of a rougher look, you can add this to that, this to your noise pass. So let's put this back to 100 to give it a bit of a, don't make it as rough. And now we have a bit of noise, and this noise is very subtle, so I'll put it at 300 to kind of show what it does. Oh, that did a lot more than I expected. Yeah, what this does, it's hard to see from any place actually. What it mainly does is it breaks up the height that you assign. So if you have a very flat section in a mountain range maybe, then it's going to add some height offset, just like the one in the objects. So yeah, try to keep that at 100 usually. And something to keep in mind, it just shifted. So yeah, there you go. Something to keep in mind is when you're using element size, and this goes for anything, if you make it smaller, then it's going to affect the amplitude more. So if you put this at 100, we're going to get some very noisy terrain. Oh, that's not. So there you go. As you can see, the noise pass now affects the terrain a lot more, and that you could want that for your terrain. But let's put this back at 650 to only get some very large noise passes, and that kind of sums up the large shapes. And when we get to the detail, it's just going to add some detail. So if we activate this, you're going to see a lot of that curl noise or simplex noise being kind of applied to this sculpt. And yeah, that again, it kind of just adds an additional level of detail. Any lower levels of detail, I would say apply that with materials or textures, because if you want to make this noise even lower element size and kind of higher or lower amplitude, that's going to require you to add a lot more detail to this terrain as well. So you're going to have to up your landscape density, and that might not be what you want. So let's disable this sculpt for now because we've went through all the tabs, and let's go to flat areas. So when we activate this, it's kind of going to affect this area if I recall, and I'm not sure about that. There we go. Yeah, I did. So yeah, this noise is mostly here to kind of fill up the flat areas. If you want your terrain to not do that, because this does add a lot of distortion, as you can see, if we disable it, it might as well be a different terrain. But yeah, this is very much there to just add a lot of, yeah, it breaks up your patterns. So that is mostly controlled by this amplitude and element size. So if we lower this amplitude to say 25, we're going to see these shapes here just plummet. And there we go. So this is already affecting it a lot less. Yeah, I put it at a high value to kind of show it off that what it does. And again, this distortion, it does the same as it did before. So if we put this at 100, you're going to see a lot of the shape is going to be broken up a lot more. This is, if I recall, Chebyshev noise, which is a very mechanical looking noise, a very square pattern. So if we up this amplitude of this distortion, is going to basically break up these shapes. Yeah, here you go. So yeah, because of the mechanical nature of the noise, I added this kind of low roughness, high amplitude, high distortion noise to break up those shapes so it doesn't look as straight. So basically this would be a straight edge, would have been a straight edge if it wouldn't have been for that distortion. And yeah, the large noise blur, again, because of it's a very mechanical noise, if I put this at 0, we're going to get some very hard surface edges. So here you go, you can kind of see that here where it became just a bit, yeah, here we can see a seam that has become very apparent because we disabled that blur. And if you turn it on again, it's going to kind of disappear. There we go, it became much smoother. So the pre-noise mask blur is basically a blur of the entire flat area range, or maybe even the whole terrain, to basically just blur your terrain. So if you put this to 100, it doesn't do a lot because the noise passes are applied to it, but yeah, if you want to blur your terrain a bit more, you can use that to kind of subtle up your shapes. And yeah, the detail section apparently doesn't work. Let's kind of disable this real quick. So what does that do? Ah, there we go. So the detail section, again, it takes care of these smaller ridges. So if you kind of, yeah, these kind of rugged details there, that's what the detail section takes care of. So if you put this at a 50, there you go, it just became a bit rougher. And this is really just to kind of add a bit more detail to those transitional areas, because the flat area itself isn't going to have a lot of height applied to it. In general, these distortions only apply to area like height differences, if that makes sense. So it wouldn't apply to the top, but it would apply to the side of it. And now we've had that, let's kind of disable this again and go to the overall section. And what this section does is it applies one final noise pass and some terracing if wanted. So here you can clearly see what the detailing pass does. It applies that distortion noise to just kind of add an additional breaking up. So it tears up that, it also makes the transition between all the noises better. So I'll put everything together in a second, but this noise literally goes over everything. So here you can see that even the objects are just kind of noised out by it. And the final option here is terracing, which has a special enable button. And when we enable this, it's going to go work a bit. And what you want to do is you want to click this compute bounding box button first. And what that is going to do, it's going to take the lowest value in your landscape and the highest value, and basically use that to make the terrace sizes, or well, the range. So let's see if I can find an area. Let's put the shrink and expand terrace amount. This is basically what you're going to be using to control how much terracing is happening in your scene. So if you put this at 1, it's going to take a bit, but then it is going to basically terrace the whole terrain. I might have done that the opposite. Let me have a look. Right. Now this should actually work. Here we go. Right, I made the step size a bit too small. Whoop-de-doo. Let's up this a bit so we can see it affecting the terrain a bit more. And there we go. So yeah, now we can see it very clearly. And what this does is it does what you can see in front of you. It adds a terracing effect. And personally, I don't like it in this high of a frequency. But if you lower the step size and kind of lower this shrink amount, this expansion amount, if you put this at 0.4 say, now you kind of see that it only affects it very subtly. So yeah, here you go. Here we basically have a very subtle terracing effect going on. Yeah, here we go. Here's a bit more. And it's only very subtle. Again, here's another bit of that terracing going on. It's very subtle, but it can add a lot more if you're going for an effect like this. And the offset basically is kind of a seed value. So what you're doing here, so if you put a value of 1,000 here, it is going to offset the noise that masks out the terracing. So it's going to appear in slightly different spots. I might have not picked the right value here, but that's what that does. And here's some other distortion values to control how much the terracing is distorted. So if we put this value at a 1 again, kind of wait for it to process. Here we go. Let's have a look at how this affects it. So if we up the distortion amplitude, and this isn't the distortion that is applied after the terracing happens. Oh dear, that's a lot. Let's not do that. Again, I kind of went out of my half rule, so let's put it at 30. I mean, this could be your jig, but I wouldn't do it. There we go. So this is just going to add a lot of distortion over that terrace, and yeah, this very rough look could be something you're going for. So finally, let's put this back at, so that's the element size. Let's not mess with the element size. Let's put this back at 10. And again, you can also see this area was just manipulated. It's only very subtle now. Let's put this boundary at about 0.4. And let's really quickly just disable the whole thing. So I'm going to press this active switch. And whilst that is going, I'm simply going to activate every noise pass in here. So flat area, sculpt, the object part. So here we go. And when we press this active switch, it is basically going to apply everything at once. And that's going to take a while. I hope it's not going to take too long. Oh, it's going pretty fast. Currently it's going decently fast because there's no erosion involved, so that's pretty decent. And here you go. Here is your noised up terrain, and right now I applied a lot of noise over it to kind of showcase every aspect of it. But yeah, you can basically tweak this as much as you want. And let's say we're looking at this and we're thinking, well, I like how everything is looking, but I don't want these flat areas to be as noisy. We can simply go to this flat area and just disable that option, and it's going to cook again. Import the landscape, and I'm wanting to say Bob's your uncle, and there you go, Bob's your uncle. So we just disable this whole noise pass on the flat areas, and only the rest remains. So yeah, that about sums up this tool. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any more questions, feel free to post a comment. More info will be in the description, and thank you very much for watching. Until the next one.